Welcome into Props and Hops, a podcast pursuing the best in betting and beer. I'm your host, Matt Landis, joined this week by Andy Molitor for an early breakdown on the NFL draft betting market in the aftermath of last week's NFL Combine. A lot of you in the audience may already know Andy as the director of content with Betsperts, also as the co-host of Brown Bag Bets, a daily sports betting live stream, and of course the Deep Dive Pod. And there's a really cool spinoff of the Deep Dive Pod going on this year, the NFL Draft spinoff, the fifth year option. Highly recommend listening to that for any of you out there who are not doing so already. Andy, I know you've got a lot going on year round when it comes to the sports betting content space. Really appreciate the time today. Welcome back to Props and Hops.
Yeah, appreciate you having me. Excited to talk. And there's a lot to talk about after, 5 days of, the underwear Olympics there over in Indianapolis.
Indeed. And I'd like to start with probably a pretty natural starting point, looking at the state of the draft betting market right now. Pretty widely available. I'm seeing markets for first overall pick, first player by position, especially if we're looking at quarterback and wide receiver, first defensive player. Beyond that, it seems like pretty slim pickings. I know that there is one big regulated book hanging player versus player matchups, so it's pretty cool to see that this early on. Given where we are right now, almost 2 months out from the draft, what's your take on the breadth of current offerings across the regulated and offshore betting markets?
I mean, I'm always going to complain and I'm always going to want more because that's just the nature. But I'd say we're probably on pace with where we were last year. It's slow, but things do start to open up after the NFL, scouting combine happens. Like you said, we did get some matchups. A lot of it is just, hey, here's the two top corners by the way the market looks at them, and here's a head-to-head, or here's Skoronski and Johnson. Like, we're going to give you a head-to-head on two top linemen, and it wasn't a big offering, but it's nice to see stuff slowly populating. In the offshore markets, there's some other props you'll see here and there, but a lot of very low limit stuff. It's basically the same thing: first quarterback, first defensive, first wide receiver, first overall. There's one that has which team, and I did see this at a regulated book as well, which team will draft in the first position, basically like who trades with the Bears kind of spot. I know some people had some bigger numbers than we expected to see on Houston in that. I think that one got hit pretty quick as well. So it's slowly trickling in. Like, what is it? It's March 7th. The draft is literally like 6 or 7 weeks away yet. There's a long time, but it'll be the slow deluge of slowly populating as we go, which I guess makes it easier to kind of digest as we move towards late April.
Yeah, especially for people like yourself who are really ramping up handicapping college basketball as well. So maybe not the worst thing that the market is on more of a gradual on-ramp. One point that I did want to run by you, I feel like a lot of popular bets that I've enjoyed making every year that have been pretty successful, not yet widely available, a player's over-under spot, especially if we're talking likely first rounders. We'll see those start to trickle in. Also, positions over under first round, how many quarterbacks, how many wide receivers, how many tight ends, and so on. When it comes to those player and position over unders, especially with a focus on the first round, do you have any sense as to when we might start to see those markets develop?
Those should be fairly soon. I would say within the next few weeks, you do start to get some of that. And it might not be the full menu of like, here's a whole bunch of over-unders. And, some of those aren't going up until during the draft. You'll see new markets populate for round 2 guys during the draft. So I would expect like how many wide receivers over under, how many offensive linemen, how many, defensive players, offensive players, that sort of stuff. I would expect that to be next. And then the over unders for the actual players, at least some of the, the ones that are in doubt, those do tend to get sharpened up pretty quick. Within the next few weeks, I think those are kind of your next 2 main markets are going to start popping up. And those are a ton of fun, especially right now if you just start looking at the mock drafts that have come out so far this week, and it's been light. I think a lot of people are taking a lot more time this week with all the combine results and all the news coming out of Indy. But you start to see like, hey, this guy was, your 15th pick last week, and he's not even in your mock right now. And, there's so much uncertainty from like 15 to 60 as far as the draft goes. It's really hard to pin that down as far as how many wide receivers will go. Tight ends will be one I think that bounces around a lot because there's people that fell in love with basically every tight end that showed up in Indy, and there's a lot of talk of many tight ends going in the first round, which is I hate to disagree this early in the process, but boy, it's just not a really high value position of need for a ton of teams when there's so many other good players out there. So that's the one I'm really excited to see what they open the tight end number at.
And when it comes to that tight end market, one quick question I want to run by you that came to my mind as you were wrapping up that answer. I feel like between the relatively low positional value and then the fact that it's regarded as a pretty deep class, I wonder if the strength of this class might actually hurt the number of first round tight ends that we see, because maybe a lot of teams going mid to late first round figure, oh, if we don't get one of the top 2 or 3 tight ends, we'll probably have some good options available next time the board comes to us.
Yeah, and even in the case of, if we don't get Meyer, there's 3 other guys that are probably going to fall somewhere between, maybe like 25 and 40, 25 and 60, and you can certainly take another swing and even trade up if you need to, if you really, really had your eyes on the guys. So that's a good point by you, Matt. I think the strength of the class can almost be a negative as far as the class as a whole goes.
I think with tight ends, that's going to be a fascinating point to watch for as we approach the first round. But before we're there, I know a lot of eyes set on Indy, as you touched on last week, with the combine. Andy, coming out of the combine, who would you say are some of your biggest risers and fallers?
Well, I guess I can just skip over the Richardson stuff. Like everybody knows what he did, and like that's going to be a whole point of contention and argument on Twitter for the next couple months as well, because everyone will say, "Well, Josh Allen did it." And it's like, yeah, well, that might be a unicorn. That might be a black swan event that doesn't just, quarterbacks don't just fix themselves like that. But amazing what he did. There was and like we just mentioned, like all the tight ends tested pretty well. Some of the measurements were, a little transparent. Like it was pretty obvious that Bryce Young had just eaten a ton of, I don't know, like he just went to an all-you-can-eat pasta bar, drank a lot of water, and like there's no chance he was ever playing at 204 last year, probably closer to 180. So kudos by him and his team to get there. But I think Nolan Smith was a good one. Like just sometimes testing out well is fine and all, but like with Anthony Richardson, it was expected. Like everybody knows he's an athletic freak. It was like, hey, this was what we expected out of him. A lot of the people were, I think, more taken by just how big of an arm he has, which again it's tough to grade some of this stuff. There's no defensive line. There's no pads on. You're just whipping it around in the, in Lucas Oil there by yourself, but still can't be denied he has a big arm. But Nolan Smith was a pretty decent riser. And then I think basically everybody that wasn't Johnson what was it, Broderick Johnson? I think that was a little bit of a faller. There was some movement in the offensive lineman market. I think kind of coming into the draft process, people put Skoronski probably first or second, like a tie for first, I guess. And Paris probably has passed him up, and you can see that in some of those head-to-head markets and the cornerback market as well, depending on how you feel about those guys. And then JSN, like it's kind of chalk now that he's first wide receiver off the board, which I don't guess fully agree with, because I think that's kind of a fit where he might not fit with everybody who needs a wide receiver. So there might be a little bit of value in the wide receiver market just based on how well he looked or how well he tested out.
I want to circle back on the topic of team and player fit in a moment here, but when you talked about Richardson, something that stood out was the fact that we all expected him to test well and look really good at the combine. And yet we've seen his odds get to, I've seen recently as low as plus 250 to go first overall. And I know he'd been seen a bit before the combine, but not too long ago, we could see him widely available in the ballpark of 50 to 1. So based on Richardson performing as expected, or you can't say he did any worse than expected. If anything, even with lofty expectations, fine, he outperformed those. But like you said, underwear Olympics, it was just the combine. When we're talking about a number in the range of plus 250, do you feel like that is anywhere near fair? Or is it safe to assume that if you have any interest in Richardson to go first overall, the number has just spiraled out of control at this point?
Yeah, if you gave me a no on that, if you gave me minus 450 or I'd probably think about it. I've bet bigger numbers than that in the draft, but you just never know with teams. Teams can be surprising. Uh, and again, a lot of this is like, why guess when some of this news will eventually just come out? Like, why bet into a guess when you can just bet into a no? Like, once we actually find out who some of these teams like, some teams, some of the dumbest news comes out of the combine too. It says, hey, there's a couple teams who have A Rich as their top quarterback on the board. They of course aren't drafting quarterbacks in this draft, but like, well, that's not all that useful because there's no stake for them. There's no money on the table for that. They can say whatever they want. They're not drafting a quarterback one way or the other. So I think something to look at with a guy like him, and because my opinion, your opinion, everyone's opinion on Anthony Richardson doesn't matter. We're not drafting him. It's the information we're getting and the opinion of these teams, these GMs, these front offices. But I think there is something to be said for how snug they are in their job. Like, I'm trying to think of just some of the good, like the Bears are a perfect example. Where they were the last couple of years. Like, you can't be taking an Anthony Richardson if you're in that kind of spot. If you're Nagy and Pace, like if you're even close to the hot seats and you're taking a big project with high upside like that and it fails, like you're just kind of writing your own pink slip. So it's more likely for him to go to a team with a front office that's pretty confident that they can get at least 2 or 3 years of, hey, this is a guy who threw for like 50% completion rate in college with an SEC coaching staff. That's the thing about the Josh Allen comparison. Like, he had a Wyoming coaching staff. This is an SEC coaching staff. SEC facilities. Like, it is a big project, and if the team isn't a spot where they're going to let the coaching staff get 3 years to fully develop this guy, it's probably a bad idea to take him at all. And there are a couple teams that have newer GMs, just coaching staffs that are in the market for quarterbacks that probably could get away with it. I just don't know if you need to at one.
One more point on Richardson. While we have seen him as low as plus 250 in the aftermath of the combine, also seeing it at probably some sharper books, to be frank, closer to 5-1 or even plus 550. So that's a pretty big discrepancy. I think a PSA, when I'm doing the show during the NFL regular season, even talking full game point spreads, it can't recommend highly enough that people shop around. But in the draft market, you can find some pretty wild discrepancies. Yeah. And it starts with the market like Richardson to go 1 overall. So Andy, I'm wondering, are there any other discrepancies that have stood out to you in the draft betting market to this stage? Or, as we touched on earlier, as things start to develop and we start to see more lines getting posted that we tend to see year over year, a player's over under, a number of players from a certain position to go in the first round, anything like that where you anticipate that we might see some discrepancies as we get closer to draft day that would be worth keeping a particularly close eye out for?
Yeah, once you get to the top of a market, it usually stays pretty tight. But I think if you're looking at someone that's like the third, fourth, fifth favorite in any of these markets, whether it's like, top wide receivers, there's a lot that has to happen before that's, honestly decided. So when you're looking around at betting into Hyatt or Flowers or some of those longer shot wide receivers, you're seeing some pretty decent discrepancies in the market there. And even at the top, it's a little different from here or there, but especially when you get into those big multi-selection markets that have 5 or more positional players listed in it. Once you get down the board, you'll see some massive differences. Like, even once you get closer to the draft, and this was not a bet that won, but there were certain places that were hanging Malik Willis to go to certain teams. I think 3 or 4 books had it, and one book was at like 30-1 for him to go, I believe, to the Giants. And everyone else was maybe 10, 15 or something. So in those bigger markets, listing teams like that too, as far as which team does this player go to once it becomes painfully apparent that like Drake London was going somewhere near the top 10, a lot of teams hung the Falcons as one of the options. And that's something we bet into last year. And again, I remember that being quite different from book to book. So the bigger the market, the more the shopping you need to be doing.
I like the point about looking beneath the surface a little bit, because so often in markets like this, if you're not betting on binary outcomes like an over, under, a yes or a no, then books can just hide so much vig in their prices. So a big plus number often isn't big enough of a plus number. but really picking apart those discrepancies that will stand out, looking at the less obvious options, I think is a really valuable process point that people can take away from this conversation. And one more point, Andy, on the combine from a process perspective, I'd be curious to hear what you think, being as close as you are to the draft betting market. I know that we get a lot of news coming out of Indy during the combine, a lot of results from where people measured in, how they tested. How much of it do you consider to be signal, or are there certain things that you consider to be signal, and how much of the rest do you just dismiss as noise?
It's like 80% noise, I suppose. I mean, it's just like the mock drafts you see this time of year, and I've talked about this before. You have people that take their craft very seriously and are really trying to set a good baseline for they're one of the most accurate mock drafters in the country, and they take pride in that, and they're really trying. And then there's people that are, hey, I mocked, Richardson. I'm the first one to make Richardson first overall, and here it is in the headlines. And I need to get this out because it's clickbait. Like, it's the same kind of stuff with some of these post combine, headline grabs. As far as if it's and I don't want to throw Eisen under the bus because I like him quite a bit, but a lot of the stuff and he talks about, I mean, it's mass media, it's big business, and they have to talk about exciting headlines like that, and they have to, even if it's just a rumor, they're going to talk about it extensively, whether it has true merit or not. So I mean, there's a ton of stuff that comes out that's just for the most part garbage, and you just kind of got to, over the course of years, vet who you think actually knows stuff. And I do keep track. I seriously have a Google sheet that I have. I mean, at this point, a lot of tweets just copy and pasted into that I've saved, and I have them organized by position groups and by players and stuff, because it's a good one to look back on too. And I have them all dated, and I can look back and say, like, well, this guy was just kind of full of it. It's like he didn't hit on anything. And sometimes, God, hope is a good way to I don't know, get interactions on Twitter, because you see these, it's like, oh, this is a small account, especially now that you can buy a check mark. You'll see this like, oh, this is news. This is like, who's this guy? And then you click, and it's a nobody who bought a check mark, but he wrote something that everybody from the fan base would sure love to see happen. So it caught some traction. Then you realize, like, oh, this is trash. So just kind of vet everything as you go, and I think you'll end up a lot better in the long run for it. And you really do need to let the combine breathe, because there's so much information that comes out of it that actually does moves these markets around, as small as the limits are. And a lot of it, you just have to sit back and watch it happen. Like, I know why this is happening. It's fine. Nobody knows anything yet. I'll let this happen and just kind of track it as we go.
And when it comes to sitting back and letting things happen, does there often become a point after the combine where you feel like you might be willing to step in and fade moves that you think are driven by a substantial amount of noise? Or, thinking back to our last conversation, it was about the NFL schedule coming out a couple years ago, but you talked about nudges, and sometimes you'll be looking for nudges not to make a bet rather than to make a bet. So I guess on one hand, you could say, hey, there's a lot of noise behind this move. I want to fade the way the market's going and actively bet against what's happening. Or just say, hey, maybe there was value before the combine, but now that the market has adjusted so much, maybe a lot of it's noise, but I'm just going to stay away. If those are, two sides of the coin for the purposes of this question, is there one way that you tend to gravitate, or is there a case-by-case basis where certain factors will nudge you in a certain direction?
I think the biggest nudge is the calendar for me. Like, realizing I'll go back and I'll actually open up my, I track everything in just one place, but I keep a separate one for the draft because I love that. And I go back and look at like how many days out I was from the draft when I made bets last year, and realize, like, you're not behind, Andy. It's still March. So the biggest nudge that's keeping me off a lot of bets is just how early it is, because I sat and hovered for a long time over Stroud to go first overall, or Stroud first quarterback, because it's just turned into a, like, man, everyone wants to talk about Bryce's weight, and how A-Rich is a freak, and Levis wasn't getting the respect he deserved, and he could be high on draft boards. And it's crazy that just Stroud kind of got lost in the shuffle. He went out and had a really good combine. He looked great throwing the ball. Like, he looked like he got it. Apparently Bryce and him tested well as well. Some of the interviews he nailed, and just didn't really move the market. Running a really fast 40 move the market more than anything. So super close to betting into some Stroud to go first overall, 4.5, somewhere in there, and ended up just saying like, I honestly don't know who gets the pick. I don't know if they actually like him. I'm probably just going to stay off this, even if it get because CLV in a market like this is honestly not all that valuable sometimes when it comes down to it. We saw I have a tweet I saved that I send to people when they get too excited, where it just lists like Evan Neal minus 200 favorite to go first in the last year, and a big part of it was pre free agency. That's the other big part of it. We're 8 days from free agency. There's going to be some players that move that are drastically going to change, a team's needs in this draft, especially up top, and that throws a whole wrench into everything.
Yeah, I really think that underscores a point that I've tried to make pretty regularly on this show over the years, is that sometimes the best bet we can make is to pass. And as bettors, the biggest edge we tend to have over the house is our ability to pick our spots. And not so much for the draft. Books can choose what they want to post and when they want to post it. But still, to an extent, a lot of books are hanging lines that they don't necessarily want to. They just feel like they have to. And that can open up a pretty big attack surface at times. But it also doesn't mean by any stretch that just because something looks interesting that we need to feel compelled to bet it. That can be great for entertainment value, but for, long-term growing the bankroll, taking care of the ROI, I think there are bigger considerations in play. And your point about not needing to feel like you're behind just because you don't have a lot of bets yet, looking at the calendar really reminds me of one of my biggest takeaways from Super Bowl props this year, where I think over the years, as I started to do it more and more, it was like, oh, the first year I did it, I would just bet the game and have all my money on one side against the spread. And then I had a few props, and then I had 10 props, and then 20 and 30. And it got to the point where saying you had X dozens of props became almost a certain badge of honor. And I really had to realize, especially this year, is things might be changing. I don't know, the opening kickoff not to be a touchback used to be one of my favorite bets. Maybe that's because the Patriots were in a bunch of Super Bowls and Gostkowski under Belichick wouldn't boot the ball into the end zone if they were kicking off to start the game. That's no longer something that I need to consider an annual staple, or Super Bowl starting slow. Again, with the Patriots, it's not necessarily a shoo-in to say no score in the first 6 minutes, second half to outscore the first half. And a lot of these bets, sometimes it's not a badge of honor to have a certain number of bets if they're not good bets. It's better to, make fewer bets with more value. And again, to your point, be mindful of closing line value in prop markets or draft betting markets. But if you don't have a lot of conviction, as exciting as this all can be, there is no need to force the hand to get in play, especially when we're, again, almost 2 months out. And like you said, less than 2 weeks out from free agency.
Yeah. I don't have a ton of big. Most of my bets were just small stuff that popped up. A lot of it went away right away. Like there was somebody that opened a few over-unders for some reason weeks ago. Like I should honestly check the date on this bet. It's crazy how early some things open for just no particular reason at all. I did bet a little bit Will Anderson to be the top defender when some books. I mean, that's another good, because so much of this is informational. Be ready. Like that's something I do every day is I open all my sports books. I go to the draft part. Like you asked at the beginning, what markets are up? I check. I know like Vegas Refund is just crazy. He does this multiple times a day, but I check what markets are up just so I know in case something happens, like the Jalen Carter news, somebody was slow. Will Anderson was still even money to be first defender. I was able to get a piece of that. It wasn't up for very long because, essentially that news took a lot of the markets down. But it's one of the only pick. And then earlier this is the 29th of January. Somebody put up a Anthony Richardson under 16.5 for draft position. It was minus 160, but I bet it anyway. And again, small limits, but those are essentially my only bets that let me get anything down. So it's like I said, I looked at my calendar. I looked at the sheet from last year and said, I'm fine. As soon as these over-unders start opening up, I'm sure I'm going to have a dozen bets like that.
I really like your tip on just opening up draft menus at different books, because so much can change day to day or even within the course of a day. And it reminds me of being at Bet Bash with Hitman, good friend of this show. And he told me some of the season-long props he was betting in Vegas, as everybody else was fixated on the national championship game between North Carolina and Kansas. He's just looking at all the prop betting menus from his phone, flipping through it. And it's not the most glamorous thing, but that's how people who win at this, that's often how they find some of the best bets. Again, you talked about betting Richardson under 16.5. while the playoffs were still going on and nobody was really thinking about the draft. And sometimes just being attentive like that might make it sound like more of a grind, but that's how I think a lot of people can uncover some of the best bets that will become available. And for those that might have missed the boat on something like Richardson to go, basically in the first half of the first round, or Will Anderson to be the first defensive player, I'd be curious to see what thoughts you might have on capitalizing on the attack surface in the draft betting market. I feel like right now there's not a very big surface to bet into, so maybe this is to consider for the weeks to come. But let's say we had a scenario using the recent past as an example to look forward. That Jalen Carter news, okay, bet Anderson to be the first defensive player taken. I kind of see a parallel to the regular season where if we get whispers of quarterback injury news, the first place a lot of people go is to the point spread or the money line for the upcoming game posted for that current week. And that's a good starting point, but it's not an end point because you can also look ahead lines, or depending on the quarterback and the teams that could be affected, futures for divisions, conferences, even the Super Bowl, or in the case of Jalen Hurts, when news of his injury trickled out, the MVP market was a little bit slow to move. So sometimes it's looking beyond just the knee-jerk reaction that everybody has. And to that end, when it comes to news leading up to the draft market and the attack surface that will expand for us as draft day gets closer, are there any different angles that you recall using in the past to back or fade, certain marquee players in draft betting markets, as such an information-driven market has really presented some breaking news that some books might be slow to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, you can start looking, look at all the different ways you could bet it. Let's say you get really good information. Look at all the different ways you can bet into it, because, once I had the Trayvon Walker news and I felt good about it, I bet as much as I could everywhere I could. And again, you hit your head on limits pretty quick when you're draft betting, because a lot of places won't take very much, especially in the offshore markets. Some places I was just, well, the hell with it. I opened up the book. I already logged in. I'm betting $25 on this. I don't care if that's how you can let me bet. I'll just know better than to log in here next time. But then you started looking at, well, what else is going to happen? If Trayvon Walker goes first, nobody else can go first. And there were still places that had Aiden Hutchinson over 1.5. And again, it was a juicy price, but at the same point, it's the same bet, just at a different price. You start hitting things like that. And then when we knew where the cornerbacks were going to start going, when we felt good about the 3 pick, you could start making bets in the head-to-head markets for the cornerbacks, or how many cornerbacks go in the first, or, the biggest mover on the Evan Neal thing was, the signing of an offensive lineman, re-signing or whatever to Jacksonville, and then suddenly it wasn't a huge need. You're going to run into the same thing if we see some of the, which this is a horrible example. I almost said, one of the bigger wide receivers that might be moving is Hopkins, and I think probably the team that probably drafts the first wide receiver is Houston. I really don't see him going back there, but in this wildly stupid hypothetical, let's just say the Texans were to sign a really high-end wide receiver in the free agency market, that changes a lot about that section. And suddenly it's like, man, the next wide receiver is like the Patriots or the Packers, and like, who have they traditionally taken? What kind of wide receivers do they need? Are they in need of a guy who's going to play in the slot a lot? Does JSN make sense in this sort of spot at all? Which, God, he's just maybe born to be a Patriot at this point. But there's there's stuff like that that's you do need to think about. Like, not only does this guy drop, he might drop below other players just because he isn't a fit for the next 2 teams that really need that position, or maybe aren't willing to take that position at this point. So everything just kind of dominoes on itself like that. If this happens, then it's a lot of if thens for sure, especially in the top 10.
And as you walk through some of those examples at the top of the draft, I'm reminded of a couple years ago. It was, I think, the morning of the first round, and news came out that was pretty reliable that the Niners were going to draft Trey Lance. For the longest time leading up to that draft, it was, what are the Niners doing at 3? And there were books everywhere with lines on, Trey Lance, let's say, I don't know what the over-under was. Let's say over under 3.5. Of course, if you knew this, you'd just go bet under 3.5 everywhere you could. But then there were even some offshores where I believe there were separate bets. One was phrased like which team will One was phrased, who will the 49ers draft at number 3? And you had some of the quarterbacks in the mix. And then another was phrased, which team will draft Trey Lance? And you basically got all 32 teams. And books can't handle, moving all of their lines as quickly as they need to sometimes. So there might be cases where, hey, they're going to pull the market on under 3.5. But if I can get the 49ers to draft Trey Lance in a drop down of, 32 teams beneath his name, yeah, they're adding a lot of hidden vig to non-binary bet types like I covered earlier. But if you more or less know the answer, that's something that books will be slower to move to. So just trying to, again, think downstream. Sometimes this market can move so quickly on information, but I don't want that to sound like people shouldn't have any hope if they don't have the chance to monitor Twitter all day from the best beat reporters. Because sometimes if you're a little bit late, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're too late if you can get a bit creative.
Yeah, and you've seen that a lot of people had, Stingley, Sauce, London. They weren't fully known, but I mean, a lot of people felt really good about those at certain points. And there was like 5 different ways to bet them. I for sure had like I mentioned, London goes to the Falcons. He's drafted by the Falcons. London goes under over, it moved to like 8.5, I believe, at the end, but there was a lot of 10.5, 11.5 that we ended up on as well. But yeah, as soon as something happens, like you said, and I believe Mac Jones was still at 3.5 at that point when wasn't it it was believed it was going to be Mac Jones before it was known that it was Trey Lance. And then, so they hung Mac Jones at 3.5 for the longest time. And once it became obvious who it was, it's just like, well, he's not going first or second. So we're going to hit this 3.5 for as much as it'll let us. And yeah, that one obviously worked out as well. I think, God, what was it, 15th?
Yeah, I think so. And I like that point because it's not just to look back and say, hey, in hindsight, here are all these slam dunks. Trying to make this as forward-looking as possible from a process standpoint. Odds are there are going to be 1 or 2, if not more, pieces of news leading up to this draft. There pretty much every year things come up where I love your point about Mac Jones when the Trey Lance news broke, because it's what's Lance's position, which team is going to draft Lance, but also, okay, who else has been in the mix in this conversation, and look at other guys and just try to be, a little bit quicker than some books. I'm reminded of what's the metaphor where, 2 friends encounter a bear and one of them starts running and somebody says, hey, like, you're never going to outrun this bear. It's like, I just have to outrun you. Like, you don't have to be first. If you're a little bit creative, you can still outrun the books in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to just knowing what markets are available to you at all times.
Absolutely. Well, one market that is pretty widely available right now, not just who's going to go first overall, but Andy, the team picking first overall, the Chicago Bears. I'd like to run by you an example of, if we think about there being a pie chart with a few different categories, do the Bears trade the pick? Do they keep it and draft a defensive player? Do they keep it and draft another quarterback? None of the above. I think I misspoke earlier. It's not available yet to, answer this from a betting standpoint at pretty much any book. But if we think, do the Bears trade the pick? Do they draft a defensive player? Do they draft a quarterback? Again, none of the above. Do they go off the reservation, so to speak? At this stage, if those options exist in the form of a pie chart, about how big would you say each slice should be as you anticipate what the Bears are going to do on the clock at number 1 overall?
I have doubts about how much leverage they actually have. Like, I don't think they're going to get this Godfather deal that just like, oh my God, the Bears just really made out like a bandit here. They're going to have so much value out of this. Although I think they realize that like even a middling offer is going to be so much better as far as how much value it affords your team compared to even if, Will Anderson, Carter, whoever, whatever defensive player you take ends up being an all-pro, the amount of picks you can get, the amount of draft capital you can get for this is greater. So I think, obviously you don't take a bad deal just to take it, but the fact that there's a couple teams vying for it, it feels like it's an almost a certainty that they do get a deal done. Knowing what GM's tendencies are is useful. We have a lot of that in Indy. We don't have a lot of that in Chicago. We know they made a pretty bad pick for a trade for a wide receiver last year that ended up essentially being a first-round pick for Claypool, and maybe that's really the only thing I have to go off of besides some of the jettisoning of defensive players, which I liked. Those are the right moves, I think, for how to build this team going forward. So I don't have a strong read of what the Bears are going to do, but I mean, enough teams have been talking to them, and it's a supply-demand thing with quarterbacks. There's There's only so many quarterbacks, and there's so many teams that need one right now. There's so many teams that would love to have one on a controlled rookie deal. And, once Rodgers lands somewhere, Carr has landed somewhere, there's just not a lot left out there. And you have to start looking at, how much are we willing to leverage to get one of these young guys? Do we like one? So my pie chart is almost like the Bears trade down at least once is, like 99%. I don't like to work in absolutes, but if they were to not trade the pick and draft a defensive player, it would almost certainly be a failure on their part.
Yeah, I know there's been some talk of the Bears holding the pick, and I think most of the people who I've heard discuss that have said so in the context of them taking another flyer on a quarterback with some high upside, not necessarily settling for a defensive player who will most likely still be on the board at least a couple picks after the first name is called on draft day. But as part of that answer, Andy, you touched on one of the X factors I wanted to run by you. GM and scouting history. How much do you look at historical tendencies from certain teams when it comes to maybe they have certain position archetypes they like to follow, or teams that tend to draft more based on need versus best available? Certain teams might value character more than others, to the extent that we can even judge that at this point for these players entering the draft. How much of a factor is that in your draft betting process, to the extent that you can get a read on GMs or scouts' historical tendencies in the draft?
Yeah, a little bit. I know a lot has come out on what we have in Indianapolis, their tendencies. They've never drafted a cornerback with reach this, an arm span that wasn't this big. And they've never signed or drafted a quarterback that wasn't at least this big. There are some tendencies, but you do have new GMs every year. It's tough to get a read on some of that. Like I mentioned, the Bears, the Vikings have, only 2 years deep into Quessie's tenure. I think you have a pretty good feel for Caserio just because he came from a system and was there for so long, and there's a bit of a tendency up in the New England way. But it's tough to get a read. And two of the top three picks have newish GMs at this point. There's a lot of talk of maybe the Seahawks, even though they paid our guy Geno, that they might still look at a quarterback because they're in such a catbird spot here. But they need a defensive player, and that's come up a bunch too with the Jalen Carter news. They have been a little hesitant to draft people with player concern, with off the field concerns like that. So there are teams that shy away from that stuff, and Seattle kind of is in that boat. And at that point, you start to wonder how far some of these guys fall, because a guy can only fall so far before a team that says, we have no business taking a player at this position, but he's just too good. Like, you can say that's not a position of need, but at this point, it's like, I have to take this guy. So the back half of the top five is going to be just as interesting as the first half with some of the teams you have involved. Obviously, the Raiders being a bit of a wild card over the years, the Falcons having a new GM maybe year 2 or year 3 after Dimitroff left, and then the mess that is Carolina, and then the mess that isn't Philadelphia. God bless them. Super Bowl, appearance and a top 10 pick. He can complain a little not winning the whole thing, but having a top 10 pick after being in the Super Bowl is really something.
Yeah, quite the enviable position for Philadelphia right now. And I found it interesting that you also talked about the Seahawks. I think we can agree that it would be quite a surprise if they took a quarterback after they just paid Geno. But I also think it's worth keeping in mind, to your earlier point about not thinking in absolutes. It's the same team and largely the same regime, if I'm not mistaken, that had paid Matt Flynn what was considered to be a pretty hefty contract at the time, and then drafted Russell Wilson. And we've seen a team like Washington with, RG3 and Kirk Cousins. So this does happen sometimes. And I think just looking at the Seahawks and saying, oh, there's a headline, they just paid Geno Smith, so for sure they're not drafting a quarterback. That's probably correct, but it's not definitely correct. And we've seen some examples in the past. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. And beyond what GMs and, let's say at the team level, what we've seen historically, I also think there are some tendencies that you might read into when it comes to the players entering the draft, when it comes to the fit. If they're a slot receiver and certain teams stack up, you think that in a certain range, we might see a run on outside wide receivers or zone corners versus man corners. Are there any areas where you see certain runs on not just a position, but a certain type of player at a specific position where you would really heavily weigh a player's fit within a certain scheme?
That's kind of what I'm starting to work on right now, because so much of that is a little ambiguous. Nobody
Mhm.
runs 100% the style defense, or 100% that. But there are some spots where it's like, hey, guess what? You have a starting receiver who runs 80% of his routes out of the slot. Like, you're going to really draft a slot receiver. You need an outside guy. You need a complementary outside guy. There's levels to these positional needs, and that's why I loved JSN to the Chargers. If Keenan Allen walks, like, what a beautiful fit. Like, should just step in day one, and not be Keenan Allen, but gosh, I mean, the upside is just as high. So there's a lot of talk about which cornerback fits Detroit's scheme the best. I know a lot of people have said like this cornerback over that, and the other teams are going to be drafting corners, or have an interest in Witherspoon, Gonzalez, any of those guys. That it is something worth putting in your notes, and that's kind of what I'm working through right now. So I don't have great answers on who fits where, because I mean, some of these mock drafts you really have to like fact check. Like, I've read a couple that said one thing or the other, and after a while it's like, I don't know if I actually believe you believe that. So I've started to kind of put some of my best fit for some of these teams that seem bound and determined to maybe be pretty stuck in one or two positional groups.
Speaking of things that people write that you on the other end might question whether they really believe it, I'd love to talk about mock drafts for a moment. And when it comes to the approach that some people take, wisdom of the crowds, just trying to put together everything and see where the averages settle out, how much do you lean in that direction versus maybe pivoting hard the other way and just focusing on the most reputable guys like a Daniel Jeremiah or a Dane Brugler?
Yeah, I think it's wisdom of the crowd, but have the right crowd. It's because a lot of wisdom of the crowd stuff comes in with guessing. If you get 1,000 people to guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, you're gonna be pretty close. But I'm not gonna compile 1,000 mock drafts, nor am I you know, gonna put a lot of faith in some of the people that would make it if I had to go that far out. So a lot of it is just having your core 3, 4, 5 guys that really, really take mocking seriously, have a long track record of being fairly accurate, and when you find inaccuracies, it's like, well, nobody knew that all these trades were gonna go down. Everybody kind of did bad in that part of the draft. And I mean, there's our certain teams that are connected to certain people who mock. It's like, this guy has a connection with this team. Like, he has sources with this team. He's always nailing, the Jets pick, or I was going to say the Pittsburgh pick. Everybody always nails the Pittsburgh pick. Everybody knows who they're going to draft a week in advance for some reason. But, there are some of those guys too, where, if you're looking at a wisdom of the crowd, but your guy who always seems to know exactly what's going on in Detroit says otherwise, you do got to throw some of that wisdom and the crowd out and just go with your, what you truly believe to be the right answer there.
And continuing along that vein, with this being such an information driven market, I mean, to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing anything, and if that's not the case, I get it. We can just give people some general recommendations to do some of the work on their own. But when it comes to really good sources from an overall standpoint across the league, or team specific guys, I think if I recall correctly, like Peter Schrager is really close to Sean McVay and the Rams. Not that the Rams ever do much in the first round these days, but are there
Yeah, it's
any
not.
league overall or team specific guys who you will be keeping a particularly close eye on as round one approaches?
I mean, you already mentioned like some of the big names, like Jeremiah's a decent sized name, and everybody knows him, but still, he just seems to be honed in on stuff early. You know, uh, Zierlin, Brugler, uh, uh, Charlie Campbell, Walter Football, Charlie Campbell. Like, some of the mocks are, and I think there's people that fall into these. You know, hey, it's March 7th. It doesn't matter what my mock draft says. Like, a guy who I value and I think does a good job of mock drafting has Bijan Robinson like in the top 5. Like, that's just not happening. Like, we're not going to be wasting that kind of, but it's fine because it's March. So it's just, I'm throwing that out, and I'm going to look for information from them further down the road. So, for the most part, it is just taking in those big names and starting to throw out some of the ones that just don't seem to be getting stuff right every year. And I hate to dog on like Kuiper and McShay, but it doesn't seem like they're the first people to get anything anymore. They're going to be pretty accurate once we get towards draft day. But take a lot of that stuff with a grain of salt. And Schefter, the same thing goes with the big newsbreakers and stuff. Like once it's out with Schefter, everybody's known it at that point. Like somebody has had that information already. So just to kind of keep an ear to the ground and continue to build up, like, not that Twitter works anymore. Like the functionality just gets worse every day, but build yourself some lists of guys like that who are just, their whole feed is just talking about quotes or picking through interviews and finding quotes from the combine and stuff. It's great stuff to just read in the morning and catch up on.
I like the point that it's not just a matter of, okay, this person is reliable or this person is not, but considering the arc of the draft betting market, some guys who've been around for a while and have really big names might skew much more accurate later in the process, and others might be reliable more early on, and then they're more or less, in line with the rest of the mainstream media later on. So there's not as much value. Some guys like Jeremiah might be rock solid every step of the way. So there's a lot of nuance here, but I appreciate the names you shared and then the context on how people can consider those names over the entirety of the process. And you also touched on the fact that, yes, we're having this conversation in early March, so any mocks should probably be taken with a hefty grain of salt. Yet, Andy, if I understand correctly, you made a mock draft in March for the first time this year. And on one hand, that is admittedly a stupid thing to do, if I'm quoting you correctly from last week's episode of the fifth year option. Yet on the other hand, you went ahead and did it. So I'm wondering what kind of value you found in going through that exercise.
It was. I think everybody should do that. Just go to any of those that let you do a mock. However, you have to do it. Say I'm drafting for all 31 teams in the first round, and start to try to do that, because I had to start over 3 times. I just kept having, and I'm not 100% sure where he's falling now. I think his value is actually a little lower, but man, I just kept having the safety from Alabama fall way out of the first. It's like, man, somebody's got to draft a safety, right? And eventually it just gets to be a puzzle. Like how far can you let people fall before somebody's just going to nab them up, even if it's not one of their primary positions of need? And it does get pretty tricky. And then obviously the whole thing is bunk when there's 3 trades in the first 5 picks after we get to April. But I think it was valuable. I'm going to continue to try to do it every week. It's been just such a tough week with conference tournaments this week, and trying to take in everything from the combine and use that to do my version 2. But hopefully I have something out here the next day or 2. But I'm expecting the same thing, where I start over 3 or 4 times, because I'm not happy where I'm at it once I get to about pick 20.
It sounds like every fantasy football mock draft I've ever done as well. After a couple of rounds, I'm like, oh, let's start this all over. But it's the beauty in going through the exercise. And while it's important to realize that, like you said earlier, we are not the ones drafting, just realizing the human element that goes into all this. If you try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes for just a moment, you can realize just how chaotic the whole process can be. And adding to that chaos this year, you mentioned there are only 31 picks in the first round, thanks to the Dolphins forfeiting their first rounder. Do you think that wrinkle is going to factor into any potential edges when it comes to, some books? Is there a chance we find anybody sleeping at the wheel when they line, number of offensive players in the first round, number of defensive players in the first round? Is there anything you're looking out for to exploit the fact that this is a rare year in which the first round will only see 31 names get called?
Yeah, I wonder if you didn't nail it there too. That's the one that comes to mind right away. Like, is somebody going to hang a bad number on that right away, where, you see that you take all the regular season win totals in the NFL preseason and it adds up to 5 more wins than can actually happen. And somebody's probably going to tie anyway. So it's 7 more wins at that point. So, there's the same kind of thing. You wonder if that's going to be a bad number somewhere when that comes up, or if somebody hangs, the offensive linemen, the wide receivers, you start adding that all up, and the median starts to creep a little higher than 31 as well. So keep an eye on those, take that into account, and then just kind of know, obviously there's one less team who needs a positional player at that point too, and everybody is scooting up a touch. Although the biggest thing I'm worried about is over-unders placed in the low 20s. If there's going to be any ambiguity on grading those, like, I'm hoping that they're just going to call the 22nd pick the 21st. But I mean, technically that pick exists and it's forfeited. So, If the what is it? The Chargers who have the pick right after? Yeah, the Chargers are right after the Dolphins. Like, is that over 20.5 or is that over 21.5? Like, I really need answers on that before I start getting into some of those markets.
That's a good point. I would only have thought that it's going to be, however many players have been drafted up to that point. That's the number that will be associated with this outcome. But if technically somewhere it says, whatever, X pick forfeited, but that number counts somewhere that gets documented, then I know sometimes books say they'll just go off NFL.com box scores. And if there's something that's wrong there, it's really important to know what's going to stand. So that's a really good call out because that could get some people perhaps a bit overextended in the unique nature of this year's first round.
Yeah, I need answers on that. Somebody needs to answer me and letting me know exactly. Like, is Goodell going to come up on stage and say the Dolphins forfeit the pick, Chargers on the clock? Like, I don't know if they want to advertise it. That's not great PR for them, but it'll be interesting if that's an actual pick that counts that no one was taken at, or if it just skipped and the Chargers are drafting 21st.
Yeah, good point. So shop accordingly, everybody out there. And Andy, I think that's a great way to wrap up a lot of the process focused part of this conversation. Also wanted to see if we could go through a few rapid fire questions to lay some final groundwork as people start to formulate their own NFL draft betting portfolios. Is there a bet on the board right now that you would consider your best bet or anywhere that you currently see an edge?
I hate to give out something that just isn't valuable. It's tough to see anything that's super bettable right now. If you like a wide receiver, if you think you can read the tea leaves, there's some long shots on wide receivers, but the limited markets that are up right now, I don't really have a great bet to place into this right now.
Very fair. So as a follow-up to that, I would draw another parallel to Super Bowl props where some of my favorite bets year over year, excluding what I had mentioned earlier in this conversation,
Yeah.
there are still some annual staples that I always kind of plan to bet, but there's no rush. Thinking along the lines of marquee players to go under, certain game props betting against human achievement, often the most value appears on game day. So in the draft betting market, is there anything that you haven't bet yet, but that you're keeping in the sights to possibly pull the trigger on closer to draft day?
Like I said, I want to see where the tight ends open up as far as how many tight ends go in the first round, because I think the media hype cycle around all of them is a little too high right now, considering that the positional value and the fact that a lot of teams are going to be looking at a lot of different players. There's so many good corners, 3 or 4 good linemen. You have all the wide receivers. You have the 4 quarterbacks. You have the all the defensive linemen that are going to go high. You're just going to start to run out of spots. Like for there to be 2, 3, 4 tight ends in the first round, there's going to be a lot of guys that have to fall. So I'm excited to see what that opens at, and if I'm going to be able to bet into an under on that one.
All right, Andy, final draft question. Then we will weave in the hops to close things out. When it comes to the NFL draft betting market after the combine, knowing the meteoric rise that we've seen for Anthony Richardson, the fall for Jalen Carter, given what we know right now, any predictions for one of the biggest risers and one of the biggest fallers between today and draft day?
Yeah, I wonder where this Miles Murphy's going to end up with. Like a lot of people mocked him in the top 10. I can see, it's so hard to keep all the quarterbacks out. It's so hard to keep maybe 1 or 2 corners. Like, I think some of the edge guys that aren't on the level of like Anderson and Tyree Wilson, I think you're going to see some edge guys drop a little bit. So maybe Miles Murphy ends up dropping or continues to drop. You're going to see, and then you're probably going to see a center. I mentioned this one other place. There's always a center. Like, there's always a center that someone's going to move over at guard. Like, watch out. Go look at the centers markets. I think I put the Minnesota center in late in the first, but there's always some teams that are going to draft some offensive linemen late in the first that maybe you don't see in a lot of mocks. Or nobody's going to sit and predict the Chattanooga guy to go get it. Or was that where the Patriots took it? I believe it was Chattanooga.
Yeah.
Like, there's going to be
that's
some
where
stuff.
McVay freaked out that the Rams were looking at him in like the 3rd round, and he cracked up when New England took him in the 1st.
Yeah, have fun predicting that sort of stuff. But there's definitely going to be some interior linemen that don't get a lot of, they're not shiny and fun like a big offensive left tackle, but some interior linemen always seem to move up.
All right. Well, Andy, thank you for all the draft insight. I can't wrap this up without weaving in the hops. And I'll use air quotes when I mention the hops because on your Twitter bio, you mention being a lover of brown liquor. So we can go into that realm instead. And I'm wondering these days if there's a go to on the brown liquor front for you right now.
Yeah, I like Barrel quite a bit. It's just they have a bunch of fun ones as far as how they've aged it. I guess the barrels they're using, the wood they're using, the different mixes, and they have a couple ryes I like. It's not very cheap though, so I try to make those last instead of ripping through a bottle like it's one of the cheaper ones. So Barrel's a pretty good one, although it is almost beer season. We've been seeing a little more beer in the fridge. We have the little beverage fridge that the wife installed last year with the kitchen remodel, and that was full of some grain belt northeasts the other day, and I hadn't had those in a long time. So I was feeling it's going to start warming up here eventually, and I'll be back on beer and gin.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with what you said. The Grain Belt Northeast was what you had stocked up on recently.
Yeah, I don't know that that's sold all that far out of the Midwest. It's a brewery up in St. Paul that's been around for quite a while. It's named after a neighborhood in one of either Minneapolis or St. Paul that they came out with a few years back. It's pretty good. So the wife likes that. Otherwise, it's usually banquet beers. You get the little grenades of those. Can't go wrong with that.
Absolutely. And whenever you can cross state lines, I think I might have alluded to this last time, but if you can get to Wisconsin and pick up anything from New Glarus, they can do no wrong in my book.
Yeah.
I'll also add that on the brown liquor side, I definitely skew more toward the hops most of the time. But I was recently in Vegas, and I guess I earned my beer or my drinks because I ran a half marathon with my wife on the strip last Sunday night, a week and a half ago, as we record this conversation. And afterward, we found ourselves at the Nomad Bar, which is at Park MGM in Las Vegas. Great bar, really cool build out, and exceptional service. I think the staff there really embraces the craft of cocktails. And I had one of the best old fashions I've ever had, and it was using Elijah Craig barrel proof bourbon. And I'd had Elijah Craig mixed in before, and that's really good in its own right. But the barrel proof version, I think it's probably more in the lines of the barrel recommendation you had earlier from a price standpoint, not the most affordable. So I wouldn't probably spring for it all the time. But yeah, one in Rome, anything featuring Elijah Craig barrel proof bourbon. I can't recommend it highly enough, especially if you're looking to bump something up on the short list of the best old fashions you might ever have.
Yeah, it's still old fashioned season. I just keep running out of oranges.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we've got those in more abundant supply out here in Southern California, but it's never not old-fashioned season, and it's never not really NFL betting season if we're being serious with ourselves. Andy, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on today and take an early look at the NFL draft for the Props and Hops audience. Those of you listening, if you're not doing so already, you can follow Andy on Twitter at AndyMSFW. And you can also find him as the co-host of the Deep Dive Pod, the Fifth Year Option podcast, Brown Bag Bets. Also follow his work over at Betsperts. Andy, once again, thanks for all the time and insight. Anything I'm missing or anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think you nailed it there. I'm just I guess Betsperts Golf as well. I do some work over there. I do some betting. I'm probably third banana over there. Ron and Ryan do a lot of the heavy lifting, but some of the best golf previews you'll find. Ron Kloss does a great job. He writes an absolute tome every week about the course and the field and what differentiates it from week to week. So those are really good to read, and they're free. It's not behind a paywall or anything. So Betsperts Golf, if you like to bet on the golf every week, there's a very good preview every Monday or Tuesday.
Love it. Well, Andy, once again, thank you to the audience. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you again with another interview next week right back here on Props and Hops.